All right, welcome to Coffee with Cornelius. In this interview, we're traveling back in time to ancient India. Ancient India is a remarkable place in terms of its creativity. In addition to mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, which rivaled that of the Greeks, the Indians were skilled in metallurgy, arts, agriculture, and warfare. A number of different religions also emanated from ancient India, including Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. However, as with all civilizations, constructing an accurate picture of ancient India is daunting. It's like a 100-piece puzzle, and you only have 5 pieces. But to help us do this, I am joined by Matthew D. Milligan, a professor at Trinity University in Texas. Dr. Milligan is an expert in early Buddhist epigraphy in India and Sri Lanka and has written on the economics of early Buddhism in South Asia. He has a bachelor's in religious studies and anthropology from Albion College in Michigan and a master's and PhD in Asian cultures and languages from the University of Texas in Austin. Matthew, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here and excited to share this really obscure topic with everyone.
It's fascinating stuff. So much of your research involves something called epigraphs, excuse me. For the benefit of my listeners, what is an epigraph and what are the challenges of working with such documents?
Yeah, so an epigraph can be basically like an inscription that's kind of rubbed into some sort of permanent material generally, or etched into some sort of permanent material, usually stone in my neck of the woods, various kinds of stones, but certainly not limited. If you look at the ancient world in general, you have clay seals and ceilings that were basically marking goods that were traded and shipped between cities. This is ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, and ancient South Asia as well. And so oftentimes you have not just little images on these seals, but also written records. So generally these are written things. Not always are they in complete sentences, sometimes just names. In South Asia, they're a lot of times just names or very, very pithy names plus like a thing that they're representing or gifting or trading some sort of good or commodity. And it's an incredibly difficult field to kind of get into because there are very few experts in the world. I myself had to completely self-teach myself how to basically approach this entire genre of studying the ancient lived religion. Basically, is kind of my
So
topic.
just understanding languages will not make you an epigrapher.
No, because there's a lot more behind each document. All right, and I use this word document kind of to really kind of strongly couch myself in the history discipline, but I'm in religious studies, so I'm a historian of religion. And so you have a document that has a written record. Usually, sometimes they also have some sort of illustration, right, or artistic mark. But they're also usually part of some sort of larger context, right? Whether that's like a pillar. Pillars have lots of inscriptions generally, or they can. It could be a reliquary casket, right, or like an urn full of ashes. So in ancient Buddhism, many of the earliest inscriptions that we have, which are the only evidence for the Buddha that we actually have at all, historically, they're written on what we would call like basically urns, right, reliquary caskets. And so they, also what's found
So you're
inside.
saying the only evidence we have for the Buddha's existence are epigraphs written on a casket. How do we know these actually point to the fact that the Buddha was a real man?
Well, we don't. This is extremely controversial, right? Because we have textual records, right, which are
Mm.
different from inscriptions or epigraphs. And the textual records can only be dated sort of, right? If you know anything about kind of philology, right, the kind of archaeology of language itself, right, and trying to say which text is earlier or later than another, and you can only relatively date these things. And so we don't know even the language of the Buddha himself. The texts, yes, there's probably kernels of the Buddha's message, the Buddhist life story inside of them, but they're not exactly historical. And plus, we know that a lot of them post-date the Buddha by hundreds of years. So what we're left with is like with regard to material culture and kind of archaeology are very short records that sometimes mention the Buddha and sometimes don't.
I see. So let's talk about your research because you are an epigrapher. You have a book in preparation of Rags and Riches, Economic Networks in the Rise of Buddhism, which I believe is based on your PhD thesis. Am I right?
Yeah. It's about half the chapters are kind of directly lifted or rewritten from the PhD. I'm adding in some new chapters based on
Mhm.
new work I've done and things like
Well, the
this. But
PhD thesis is fascinating. I've read it, by the way. And at the start of the manuscript, at the start of your PhD thesis, that is, you mentioned the curious story of a wealthy wizard from Myanmar and his group who came to the town where you were living in North India. Can you please tell us the story and how it relates to your research? Because it's a fascinating hook into the
right. So
topic.
my research really, like, at least this book project, is about the origins of Buddhism, right? I want to
Yeah.
explain how Buddhism became Buddhism through an economic lens, right? And my argument that Buddhism emerged as a religion uh, through embracing like very liberal, what we would call classically liberal economic practices, right? And so I started this dissertation, and now the book will also start with this story about when I
Sorry,
was
sorry.
doing some
Just to clarify, by classically liberal, do you mean things like free market economics or, free trade?
something
Okay.
approaching that, right? It's really
Yeah.
hard to say about 500 BC,
Right. Sure.
but something that seems to have this idea in mind, right? That the state shouldn't be controlling the market, whatever that might be. And so I have this idea that, and we can talk about this later too, that the Buddhists were the first to kind of, at least in South Asia, to kind of actually have the light bulb come on that they could be private institutions that would engage in
Hmm.
serious trade and commercial activity. And so when I was doing field work, actually, I was teaching, but also doing field work in Bodh Gaya. And so Bodh Gaya is where the Buddha himself reached enlightenment, according to tradition. Right? We have no reason to dispute this, actually. And so I was living in a Burmese monastery there. It's very famous with some students and things, and they had pilgrims come in from Myanmar. And they were led by this guy that was dressed head to toe like he was an 80s game show host on TV. And he had this silver jacket on that was sparkly and just like, anytime light hit it, just radiated. I mean, it was like glowing, this jacket. If he could have worn, Christmas lights all over his jacket, like, I mean, this was a Western suit, right? If he could have worn Christmas lights on it to draw more attention to himself, he would have, right? And so this man, we learned, and I say we because this is me and a couple of other scholars that were kind of working there at the time. We learned that he was the pilgrimage tour leader. He was also practicing wizard. And so in modern day Myanmar and also pre-modern Myanmar, there's this kind of special class of Buddhist or quasi-Buddhists professionals, right, that engage in kind of otherworldly magical techniques. So they cast spells and they practice alchemy, right? And they do healing. And there's all these fantastic stories about their powers, right?
Mm.
They can see past lives, they can teleport. And basically, though, what we gathered from this wizard, and I won't say his name or anything. I don't want to like cause any controversy in that sense. But he was extraordinarily charismatic, right? I mean, I say game show host because the way he manipulated groups, right, and people around him, and every night they partied in the monastery. They had parties, right? They were literally throwing money around. To the monks as well that were in residence of
Wow.
the monastery.
Making it
They
rain.
were dancing, singing. They had karaoke every night. I mean, it was really hard to sleep. But this man's charisma just oozed, right? And everybody was just completely infatuated with him. And I saw him at various times go up to Indian policemen that were guarding the Mahabodhi temple. This is where like
Mhm.
the shrine that commemorates the Buddha's enlightenment, right? So he would go up to them and like he would kind of do this like Jedi mind trick, right? To kind of convince them to just like step aside and let him and his followers just kind of go in, right? Realistically, he may have bribed them. Who knows what was going on? But it looks like he's casting a spell or he's like a Jedi master. And he did this with all sorts of number of people in charge of of various activities, right? Like if you wanted to get, I don't know, a local, like a little local hotel, which has food and water, right? If he wanted them to donate water to his followers, he would just like do this, and they like all of a sudden all these little boys with water bottles would come out and just give everybody, and he never paid for anything. It was just like it just happened, right? And so this kind of made me start thinking about the power of like charisma and kind of a Weberian sense in terms of rooting religion and routinizing religion as something like very tangible, right? Kind of creating like a fellowship of a community based on, you know, a charismatic leader, as what we might call them. And so there's this whole class of these wizards in Myanmar that are re-emerging now with kind of in the modern times, and they're very powerful, very wealthy. Traditionally, you would see them kind of on the roadside, kind of, you know, offering take $5 and they're going to tell your fortune. Nowadays, it's way more institutionalized, right? And they're in charge of industries. You know, they might be CEOs, or they, you know, might be I don't know, prominent monks in the forest. I mean, they could be anybody and anywhere, so theoretically, right? And so I use this to kind of couch my argument about religion and Buddhism in general, going back to the very beginning. Like, you know, why is the way religion might be practiced today, why is it so different, or is it different, right, from how religion would have been practiced 2,500 years ago? And my argument is that no, people are always attracted to charisma.
Mm-hmm.
People are always interested in financial survival, right? That's a huge part of my work, is financial survival of this institution of monks, and behind me you see some monks. And without economic prosperity, right, they can't have a solvent institution. They can't continue on. So every world religion, I think, has to necessarily figure out a way to engage with commerce, right? Has to find a way to get profits in order to survive. Now, I'm not attempting to boil religion down to financial survival. I'm just saying that the institution of religions must necessarily engage in financial success. And I think the wizards, right, are kind of one really interesting way in the modern world of doing this, right? To kind of secure financial success, because they provide services and leadership.
And this is what you do in your own research, right? So what in your own research, you basically are looking at donative inscriptions, I believe, which is inscriptions from donors to these Buddhist temples and Buddhist monasteries. Just briefly, tell us a little bit about the research and three surprising findings from your research, because I'm always curious. You know, I think that's a good way to talk about it, is three surprising findings from your research.
Right. So one of an article of mine that just came out this past month basically applies the modern idea of bootstrapping in the kind of modern venture capital sense of pulling yourself up by your financial bootstraps, right?
Mm-hmm.
And applies that to the first Buddhist monks and nuns that we have any records of, any historical records of. And so I'm basically kind of arguing, I don't mention Steve Jobs, but everyone has the idea of Steve Jobs in their head, right? Steve Jobs and his buddies starting Apple computers with their own money in their garage. And so what they do is they invested their own resources into their company, and which eventually grew and had success, and inevitably. And so what I found actually was that this practice was occurring from the very earliest historical layers of Buddhism that we can find. That the Buddhist monks and nuns, they were either privately wealthy themselves and then using that private wealth to fund their religion, or they were professional religious persons, monks or nuns, and then became privately wealthy, and then use that money to fund their religion. And so what I've done is I've sifted through thousands of these short donative inscriptions, which are what I call like financial records of the ancient world. And it's all we got, basically. I mean, I wish we had better records, but there are thousands of them. And if you read them together in mass as a kind of a unified body of sorts, you can start figuring out the chronology of it. And then you can start figuring out individual players, right? So who are the major figures, major donors, who are the rich people, who are the poor people, this sort of thing, right? And you can start dividing up into demographics. Now, I wish I had the numbers and the data to really apply some really advanced statistics to this. Like I wish I could do linear regression with these things, but the data is not good enough,
Hmm.
and quite frankly, it's also not it's not enough material. So what we're dealing with is like a really difficult source material that I think I've solved the riddle and dating the different layers of these financial records, right? So some date from this year, some date from this other year, and later years. And by doing that, you can actually trace diachronics, right? You can figure out the development of an institution. And for me, that's step one, but I've spent 10 years doing that now. So,
So
yeah.
just coming back to this point you made earlier, what you were saying is that monks and nuns of Buddhism were essentially the financial elite, which is pretty surprising to me because I thought that in some sense, I mean, I'm not an expert in Buddhism at all. I'm not Buddhist, but my understanding is that Buddhism attains towards freeing from attachment, right? Freeing from all worldly attachment, and that would include money, especially money, I would imagine.
Oh yeah, and there are rules, right? And if you read the monastic rules
Hmm.
for monks and nuns, they are disallowed from possessing money. Now, there are ways around this rule, right? Like, as they're framed 2,000 years ago, they had no sense of what a credit card was, right? So, do these
Right.
rules disallow a credit card? That, is
Hmm.
it money? It's really referring to gold and silver. However, we know that they were just breaking these rules, right? Either they were finding really super creative ways around the rules, the restricting them, or they just didn't care. We have evidence that they were, in some monasteries, they were forging or minting their own coins, probably counterfeiting their own coins. So imagine the possibilities when you have kind of a mob, if you will, of professional religious adherents that have the power to mint their own currency, right?
Hmm.
That mimics the state currency, right? I mean, they have infinite purchasing power then, theoretically. Yes, the financial elites, and again, it's a chicken or egg question. Were they financially elite before becoming monks or nuns, or did they become financially elite
Yeah.
because they're monks or nuns? That is like, whew, I'm working on that, but I would say that's pretty interesting.
So I have a question about the records. You say that they're not complete, but does their incompleteness tell us something about them? And what I mean by that is for some period, you might examine the archaeological record and you might find tons of records. And in another period, you might find that things are very silent, right? So does that period correspond to things like wars or famines or other events that would affect the economic well-being of that civilization at the time?
Yes, I think we're going to be able to get there, but frankly, I don't think there are enough scholars working on this field yet to be able to make such observations, because we need. There are about, I would say, about half a dozen sites that are comparable-ish to the site that I worked on. I chose one particular site because it was the largest, biggest site with the most
Hmm.
records. And so I spent literally 10 years rereading these things and just staring at them for long periods of time to try to figure this out. And if we could take the other half a dozen sites that have archaeological sites, right, that have these records, and start kind of reading them together into a bigger project, I think we could really do something with the kind of long-term macroeconomic and political trends of early historic South Asia, so 500 BC to about 500 CE. We know the chronologies of kings pretty well, and we have some sense of kind of secular developments, right? But we don't have any sense of trustworthiness, right? Just because a king says it so doesn't mean it is so.
Hmm.
And so one of the things I'm working on now is sorting out what's propaganda and what's not. And so I have an article coming out that I wrote with a student that basically is questioning, are these documents a lie? and
So, for example, the edicts of Ahsoka.
mhm. Right. So this is, we know that he's a very charismatic king, right? And he has lots of power. And he has this really compelling story of converting to Buddhism after slaughtering, millions of people kind of thing, right? But what I found in my research is that most of this mythology around this king, Ashoka, postdates him by 400 or 500 years. I mean, it's later written Sanskrit sources are essentially coming up with a mythology of this king,
Hmm.
and we can't trust it, right? Like as a
Yeah.
historical record. And so to conflate what's written by him, or at least by that he made to be written, with what the kind of mythology behind this king is, I think is a disservice to the historical record, right? And not to say that there aren't kernels of truth in the text, right? But these are legendary stories meant to invoke piety, like Buddhist piety, in its readers. And so if you read them as separate things, then you get two different types of Ashoka, King Ashoka. And one, he says that he's the, he's building all of these things for Buddhists and for Jains and Ajivikas, which is another religion of ancient India. But at the same time, we don't know exactly what he's building because there's nothing else. We don't have very much archaeology dating to that time. And so he says he does one thing, and then we have a lack of evidence for anything else. And so what I found is that actually private corporations, private Buddhist corporations, were actually the ones responsible for building most of the early temples and
Hmm.
stupas and things like this for Buddhism. Now, for Hinduism, it's a completely different story, and it's even harder to work with. So the Buddhists were the first to kind of do this actually in South Asia. That's why I think they're so unique and so fun to work with, because these are the renunciants, right? They're not supposed to be doing stuff. They're not supposed to be building stuff that's going to last 1,000 years, let alone
Hmm.
2,000 years, right? Buildings wise, but they did. And so, how did they do that? That's kind of the question I'm working with.
It's really interesting. This topic of a lack of data or whether the sources are trustworthy. I'd like to turn to that now. I would actually like to talk about financial markets at the time in a minute, but for now, I'd like to follow along this theme that you started. We've talked about, can you sort out these edicts from propaganda, right? Are they factual? Um, Gregory Clark, who is an economic historian, he has a book called A Farewell to Alms, and he talks briefly about India with respect to economic development. He says India, a continent sized society with a population at least 10 times that of England in 1800, has a startling poverty of wage, price, and population records before the 19th century. So I'd like to compare like for like here. Let's take epigraphs from ancient India, and let's take all of the archaeological and source material, primary source material that we have for ancient India. How does that compare to the source material for the ancient Mediterranean? I'm talking in particular about Greece and Rome here.
Right. So, and not just Greece and Rome, but kind of in Turkey and kind of the Near East in general, right? I mean, it's just, there's a lot of wealth of resources. And I have friends working on epigraphy in that neck of the woods. And I am embarrassed about the state of my field in
Mm-hmm.
South Asia. Um, was it maybe about 5 years ago or so, I had a friend, I was living in DC, and I had a friend come and he was going to go to I think Catholic University to look at some old rubbings of Jewish inscriptions, I believe. And so he was going to do a 3D image of the inscription. And so he showed me how to do this, and I went with him and just kind of watched and learned. And like, I had never even heard of 3D imaging of inscriptions. I had never even learned of any of these techniques for digitally looking at inscriptions.
Hmm.
And so I would say that like the field of ancient Mediterranean epigraphy is like 50 years ahead, basically, probably, of where we're at
Amazing.
in South Asia. And so with regard to like, Clark's assertion, I would say it's partially true. Now, of course, the colonial period, I'm not a pre or post-colonial scholar of South Asia or Asia in general, so I can't really speak to the records, but I know that there are better records probably after year, I don't know, 1200, 1300. Once you start getting the kind of the setup of the Mughals and then eventually the British and everything else, you start getting much better records. But
Hmm.
there's also, these documents haven't had a chance to disintegrate, so it's uneven.
So that's one thing I'd like to ask you. We talk about the colonial period, we talk about the Mughals, the Khaljis, the British. Did they destroy any of the historical records? We have some evidence, for example, that the Khaljis destroyed a lot of Buddhist and Hindu temples in the north of India.
Yeah, I haven't looked into them and what's happened there, but I do know that the British had some sort of idea about kind of the they had Protestant ideas that they were forcing onto Buddhism. Now,
Hmm.
Buddhism for many I don't know, kind of Victorian gentlemen, right, was set up as a rational philosophy, right? And so when the British started doing basic archaeology and doing trenches and things like this in India and just kind of going treasure hunting, but also there was they did some very legitimate work that I'm very in awe of, to be honest. But they anything that didn't fit their narrative about what Buddhism was, they kind of tossed to the side, so to speak, right? So if they found some sort of votive commemorative statue or a funerary urn that wasn't dedicated to the Buddha, they would toss it to the side. Now, sometimes they would destroy it. Sometimes they did end up preserving these things in the end. Sometimes they threw, like at my site, they threw a bunch of stuff into the river. So it's complicated. And yes, it's the colonialist project. I think that many of the excavators had um, very genuine concerns about the project that they were doing, and so they were very interested, but they also had a certain agenda. And so I would say yes, they were destroying things, uh, but not necessarily to the extent that we might think. I think that they really did want to preserve a lot of stuff. They also really wanted to find treasure too, right? So they were excavating, looking for gold, and that and when they found the Buddha's relics just south of Nepal, actually, at the site that I referred to earlier in the talk here, they used these ashes, right, as kind of political leverage for by gifting them to the King of Thailand. So there's all sorts of things going on here that's really difficult to sort out with regard to the preservation and the study of kind of old dead stuff and the colonizers, right? I can't really speak much more to that topic. I would say that yes, they were destroying, but not to the extent. I don't think it was overtly malicious, to be honest. I think that they really thought
Hmm.
that they were doing a favor to the South Asians, but also I think that they thought they were doing really good history.
So
And
Buddhism was conflated, I guess, with Stoicism in a sense, right?
yeah, oh, it still is. I'm actually writing this really weird article now because I'm quarantined, right? So I can't do a lot of field work. I'm writing this kind of new article on self-help books in modern American business world. And I'm kind of looking at a lot of these podcasters that are kind of conflating Stoicism with Buddhism. And
Hmm.
so we see this continuing on for the advice that's being propagated to modern day managerial consultants, so to speak, right? And they're kind of looking at this what I call nebulous Buddhism. That's like not really Buddhism, but it's kind of Buddhist inspired or Buddhist adjacent. And so they're kind of stealing a lot of these ideas and incorporating them into business practices, right? Kind of finding efficient productivity practices like mindfulness, right? There's a whole discussion on
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard about this mindfulness thing. So you talked before about how Buddhist and ancient Indian epigraphy might be 50 years behind the ancient Near East epigraphy. Is part of that a function of the fact that not a lot of scholars, you mentioned that, not a lot of scholars are working on this? I mean, Walter Schedel had this speech at I believe at the Classical Historians Conference, where he said that not a lot of people in the United States or in Europe or even anywhere really is working on ancient India as there should be, right? I mean, it's a vast subcontinent, South Asia. Is this a problem?
Yes, and there's lots of work to be done. It's not like
Hmm.
there is, a scarcity of records. I mean,
Yeah.
just just to sift through the textual, let's say not even Buddhist, but just the kind of what we might call Hindu or Vedic textual record of religious literature. That could be, and looking for economic thought in these texts, and then kind of trying to boil it down to practice. Now that's a whole really difficult project, but just to do that, just to sift through the kind of body of early Hindu literature, which includes this massive amount of legal literature that my teacher actually has translated almost all of. Just to do that would be 2 or 3 dissertations. I mean, like, this could be a project that a team could undertake. And then to compare that with the Buddhist side of things, right? Sifting through Buddhist religious literature, looking for economic thought, again, 2 or 3 or more dissertations just waiting to be had. Now, then you get into the historical side of things. Art historians of ancient Indian Buddhism are very few and far between, and they could really contribute to this because the epigraphs, the inscriptions, are often written on pieces of art.
Hmm.
And so to ignore the art is a huge disservice to the history of the project. There definitely are dissertations that could be worked on connecting better the artistic production of images, cult Buddhist images, with the kind of, I don't know, economic value of these images. And not just images, but sculptures and figurines and paintings. There are caves, especially in Central Asia, with lots of paintings going up into China and things like this that are pretty well preserved. And so most of the work that's being done actually on ancient Buddhism is done ancient Central Asia these days, or kind of going into medieval China. And so a lot of the academic jobs are actually being constructed, I think, partially because China is such a political force in the modern world, economic political force in the modern world. So people are more interested in exploring and fleshing out that history, which is I agree, totally valid and very rich. I mean, there's so much material, and way better than the South Asian material, because the South Asian material is difficult to date. It's sparse, and the languages are, you got to spend a lot of time. You can learn Sanskrit in a couple of years, but to really be able to read a piece of religious literature alongside its commentaries, that takes 10, 15 years to really be able to kind
Wow,
of
that's insane. That's
um,
crazy.
so yeah, to just be able to kind of start parsing everything out appropriately, right? As a professional scholar would do, it just
Hmm.
takes time, right? And you have to have these basically these teams of scholars that we just don't have. And myself, I went to one of the largest and most prominent South Asian departments, South Asian area studies departments in the world, and I never heard the term economic history one time in 10 years.
No way.
Yeah,
That's
and
insane.
I didn't even know this was a term
Yeah.
until after I finished writing my dissertation.
Yeah.
And like, honestly, I'm embarrassed to admit it, but that's the state of the
Hmm.
field. And I knew right as an undergrad, I knew I wanted to study epigraphy, but there was nobody to teach me how to do that.
So on
So
the positive side, I would have to say that this is a good thing in a way, because there's a lot of low hanging fruit, right? You talked about all of these documents that still need to be sifted through. You talked
and
about
translated too. Yeah.
and translated. This is maybe a great time. Maybe this is the best time to be an economic historian of South Asian culture. Excuse me, the South Asian history. One
Mhm.
thing I do have to ask you though about South Asia in terms of its economic history is how well developed were financial markets? Because we have these donative inscriptions, we have these financial transactions, but did they have banks? Did they have savings instruments like we have today? Were there sophisticated credit instruments? What was the state of the financial markets in
Ooh.
ancient India?
Well,
Yeah.
the best answer is that I just don't know, and
Mm.
I don't think anybody does. So
Mm.
we can approximate some of this knowledge. The best source for this is actually a second century CE text called the Arthashastra, which is basically a manual for how to govern a kingdom. And this is one of the only things that really overtly talks about like everyday tangible stuff that might happen, right? How to weed out corruption, how to establish weights and balances, right? What is allowed to be traded, what is allowed to be taxed, how to tax, how much to tax. I mean, all of this stuff that we might think is like just extraordinary, right? Is very boring to most of the scholars of South Asia, I think. And the question is why? Well, because the Arthashastra is not concerned with religion at all. Honestly, if it doesn't have much to do with religion, it's understudied,
Mhm.
and that's what I found, is that there's all this low hanging fruit, and I've been trying. I'm just one person, and I've been bouncing around at different like academic institutions the past few years too, and the longer I stay at a place, the more I'm getting my students to work with me on this project. And so that would be like, that's the dream, right? Is to have classes where I could teach, the economics of religion, but then eventually, have that turn into a graduate seminar, the economics of ancient India, or something like this, right? And we could really do like students can do original work, original
Mhm.
projects here without any real problems, because the data is there, right? The British were tremendous about publishing stuff, but then it's been left there for now a century or even 2 centuries almost. And so when I was choosing my project, I found this and I was like, wait, why hasn't anyone retranslated all these things? Why hasn't anyone gone to the site to look for more? These kind of basic things that you can do, right? And I'm certainly not a Sanskrit genius, and there are like legitimate, I think, philologists that are just 3-4 times more intelligent than I am, right? That are doing very, very nuanced studies of texts, but they're not interested in the kind of socio-political or socio-economic lives of ancient Indians or ancient South Asians. Um, so the brain power that is in the field typically is redirected. And so, I'm attempting, I'm just one person, and I'm attempting to kind of do this a lot myself. And there's a lot of work to be done. And like
Mhm.
this summer, actually, I have a research assistant, and we're sifting through some of the ancient Buddhist non-canonical literatures in Sanskrit that are stories about merchants, and we're going to basically outline these stories and put the data available that we can extract from the stories on a website. We're
Cool.
going to launch probably in July, economicsofbuddhism.com. So it's a little
That is
pitch.
awesome. That's really cool. I think that's a great initiative. I have to
And to
ask
start
though,
open access data, right? To share data.
yeah, sure, yeah. I have to ask, to the extent that there is an economic history of ancient India, and I'm not an expert in this by any means, but I have read a little bit about it, and it seems to be dominated by Marxist historiography, which is fascinating in many respects. And you can see it in the work of prominent scholars, or like Ramila Tharper, Irfan Habib, R.S. Sharma. To what extent is it true that the Marxist historiography, and for those of us who don't know, just explain what this is. To what extent is it true that this has dominated the field of ancient Indian economic and social history?
Yeah, I think, I mean, looking at kind of the modern history of, uh, and
So
I'm definitely.
first of all, just briefly explain what is Marxist historiography. Just it's of course people hear Karl Marx and they think, oh, communism, socialism, the Soviet Union. But Marxist historiography is a very specific way of approaching history, right?
Mhm.
So you can be a
Right.
Marxist historian, but you may not actually be a communist or a socialist.
Definitely, right. And maybe you are.
Maybe, yeah.
So I think in the kind of post-independence academic world of India, the major institutions are really interested in kind of people's history, right? Thinking
Mm,
about from the ground up, thinking about what are the social lives of people, modern and pre-modern. And so I think this is really what's been happening with since the 50s and 60s, definitely, right? Trying to explore who are the everyday people, and so that's one thing. And then kind of reading kind of, I don't know, I guess the class into this. And in India, and especially ancient India, you have the Varna system, the caste system, And so trying to kind of, rediscover the lives of Shudras, for instance, right? Whoever these might be, and what are their
So hold on, just let me get this clear. So Marxism views a lot of social interactions through the lens of technology and class.
problems.
And so what you're saying is that these Marxist historians have tried to project the class system onto the caste system in India. Am I right?
Right. I think
Yeah.
that's part of it, right?
Yeah.
Definitely. And so a lot of in the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of recently at that time, recently
Hmm.
trained historians that were very interested in this, and that became very prominent. Like Ramala Tapar is, she's called the dean of Indian history for a reason.
Yeah.
I'm published very widely.
She's
Um,
brilliant.
she's just done so much work, and she really put the king Ashoka on the map that we talked about
Hmm.
earlier with her book about Ashoka. So yes, and the problem I think is that Marxist historiography is kind of at least in the Western world, has kind of fallen out of fashion, right?
Hmm.
And is only so useful, right? And I think a lot of modern academic institutions in India, maybe and elsewhere, don't have the kind of funding to keep new theories pushed through, right? To keep evaluating things. And so what I find with a lot of publications that are coming from a lot of these scholars from the 70s, 80s, and 90s that are still publishing, they're not taking up new topics. And there's a lot of rehashing of old data. There's a lot of kind of basically rephrasing. I
Hmm.
wish I had this ability, but I really sadly don't. But like kind of rephrasing lit reviews over and over again of the same sources, right? Kind of reviewing the same 10 texts and saying the same 10 things about these 10 texts. And a lot of it's just very much parroting, I think, without adding in new data. And so I think when you have a lack of new data, you have a lack of theoretical perspective to use to apply to that data. And so this, I think, speaks to the problem of archaeology in India, which there's a lot of archaeology being done, but not a lot of publications. Certainly very, very little on epigraphy, to be honest, and even from Indian scholars. And also, I think now we're getting projections of nationalist visions onto history, right? Kind of
Sure.
reimagining history from Hindu national.
And I guess
So
the I guess Buddhist nationalism as well in Sri Lanka, right?
exactly
Yeah.
right, and Myanmar too. And so it's now the project is not so much so Marxist, but now it's trying to, in some cases, not everybody's like this, but in some cases trying to prove that the monkey bridge to Sri Lanka was really built by monkeys, right? Like,
By
and
Hanuman.
yeah,
No
exactly.
way.
So this isn't a
Yeah.
productive use of our data
No.
or time in a lot of cases, right? So I think if we can have new excavations, fresh excavations with fresh data, we can have some new interesting questions to ask. But
So the
without a lot
time
of this,
is kind of ripe for a paradigm shift
I
in
think,
ancient Indian history.
oh, definitely, yeah. And what happens is one of my mentors, who was an archaeologist of Buddhism, he has now given up studying India. Like he's no longer going to excavate or do archaeological survey in India because of the problems that are posed with trying to do that. And so, yes, there are South Asian scholars that are doing extraordinary work, but they're having trouble publishing. And then they're also having trouble translating, right? A lot of stuff
Hmm.
is written in very short journal articles in regional languages, Telugu or Kannada or something like this, that are not accessible to a lot of scholars. Like I can't read these languages myself. I can read Hindi, but Sanskrit and Hindi, they might connect a little better. Um, Tamil, a lot of publications in Tamil and things like this. And so, it's really kind of a self-isolating world of lack of publications, lack of serious publications, lack of translation, and then lack of generally sharing of any data that might be excavated or
Hmm.
found. Occasionally stuff pops up, right? There's a new Buddhist site, but I mean, excavated 30 years ago, called Kanaganahalli in South India, that has many 300 or so, 400 donative inscriptions, lots of artistic evidence, and the publication has only now come out basically 10 years ago, and nobody's looked at it. And so it's like, again, lots of low-hanging fruits, and unfortunately, the lowest hanging fruits are always the religious literatures, right? You can go
Yeah.
pick up the Penguin translation of the Law Code of Manu that my teacher did, and you could sit there and study that, and you could write a master's thesis just on that, like no problem. And that might be good work, right? You might be able to do good work on that, but it's not, you're not adding any new value to the.
Mm-hmm.
We have this open access theory now of sharing stuff online, right? And you're not adding value to the community by kind of rehashing the same texts over and over again, right? Whereas, what I'm trying to do is not only provide new data, but I'm also trying to read some of these texts alongside the new data, right? So
Right.
what can we see when we compare and contrast this material?
Sure. So I have a question about that. You talk about these low-hanging fruits and these, we talked about how there needs to be a paradigm shift in ancient history. There is a paradigm shift, I think, to an extent occurring in Greco-Roman classical history. So scholars are using natural archives. They are using tree ring data. I've used tree ring data in my own work. They're using pollen samples, ice core samples. They're trying to reconstruct weather patterns and climate patterns in the past, because most past civilizations were agricultural, right? And
Mm-hmm.
therefore the climate is definitely going to be a key forcer of major agricultural activity and therefore major economic activity. Is a similar trend occurring in Indian history? I mean, based on what you're telling me, probably not, but has anybody ever tried to reconstruct climate data for ancient India and tried to use that as a way to say, let's proxy the economy at the time,
Mhm.
right?
So my real answer is that there's not a lot of it, but
Yeah,
there have been some attempts. Now, the site of Sanchi, where I did my dissertation field work at, there's an archaeologist, Julia Shaw, in Britain, that she's worked with some. I'm not sure what their specializations would be, archaeobotanists and things like this. She's worked with scientists to actually think about rainfall and the impact on the religious landscape around this site. And so I think that they have at least thought about this question. There have been some attempts, I believe. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I've completely left out the whole conversation about the Indus Valley or Indus-Sarasvati River civilization.
sure, yeah.
There is a tremendous amount of Western archaeological work that's being done on this civilization, and they keep finding that the civilization isn't just along the Indus. It's actually massive, and it's spread out for 1,500 years or 2,000 years, and they're looking at, I think, a lot of kind of data like this. There, that's definitely not my field, but I do know I see publications where they are applying, I think, what we would call these modern techniques, right, to investigating the ancient history of these places. We're finding, I think the latest research shows that the Sarasvati, the kind of mythological Sarasvati River, which was kind of ran parallel to the Indus River, dried up at one point, or at least shifted. Right, and so there's this concept of studying the climate reactions of this river drying up or shifting and then drying up, and what that would look like for the peoples, right? And so maybe I think that there's this argument that the Indus civilization has spread out further and further because searching for more river valleys to inhabit, right?
Yeah.
And so that impacts commerce, definitely. But the problem is this doesn't get a lot of publicity because we can't read their script. And so all of the seals that we have with what's proposed to be a written system, we don't know what it says. And so, the minute that we can translate that, like me, and I'm certainly certain that many other scholars are going to be all on top of that. I mean, that's a reservoir of really good economic historical data
There's
that we don't have.
there's no Rosetta Stone for the Indus Valley script.
maybe out there somewhere. But until we do more archaeology, so go ahead and excavate it, and then we can find it.
Yeah. So a question about the way that the economic history of India is framed. In Greco-Roman history, there is a divide between so-called primitivists who believe that the ancient economy was primitive and rent-seeking, and therefore you can't study it with modern-day economic tools or economics. And then there's modernists who claim that the ancient economy resembled a modern market system in many ways, and you can study it using things like supply and demand. Is there a similar debate in India among Indian classical economic historians? I mean,
I
to
don't
the
think there
extent
are.
to the extent that you're telling me like this is not even a debate, right? It's just it just seems to be the case that there is no sense of real economic history in ancient India. But if there were a debate, let me try rephrasing the question. If there were a debate, which side would you fall on? Or to the extent that it's a continuum, to the extent that it is a continuum, how would you place yourself on that continuum?
Well, I think definitely my research has shown that what I'm what I'm finding in certain Buddhist communities, and this extends to Sri Lanka as well.
Hmm.
I've been doing a lot of translation and field work in Sri Lanka these past few years now. So the Buddhist kind of world of South Asia, I think, is going to fall on kind of the modernist side of the spectrum, because we're definitely finding kind of very advanced thinking in terms of like record keeping, and thinking about profits, and also the role of merchants, the mercantile classes. And I would not really dare to say that this is really modern in any sort of stretch of the imagination, but I believe that they are reacting to a supply and demand philosophy, right?
Hmm.
They are reacting to the religious demands of communities, and they are supplying, right, and also consuming. I'm working on a paper right now, thinking about Buddhist monasticism as a consumer brand, actually, and so yes, I think that. There are some scholars. There's one terrific Indian scholar, Ranabir Chakravarti, who's written a lot about merchants in ancient India, mostly from the textual side of things, because that's where most of our data is. But he's also done some inscriptional work and things like this. And I think that he would probably argue that these kind of we don't have any sense of real sense of the financial instruments, but we have demographics that claim that these people probably existed. So bankers, for instance.
Hmm.
This is a controversial translation of his term Shreshtin, or in Buddhist texts, Satans, and so we translate them as bankers, but what they are probably guild leaders. What they are guild leaders that are probably in charge of distributing gold and merchandise.
Right.
And so, is that a modern kind of market philosophy? I don't know. I would call it corporate. That's where I've been working towards, is
Hmm.
kind of thinking about the kind of development of like the kind of entrepreneurial spirit, I think, of a lot of these kind of these social cooperatives, or whatever you might want to call them. And so, Shristans or Satans are definitely not bankers in our sense. But they are in charge of probably materials that could be lent out, right? That could be rented, or that could be sold, and they're really guild masters, is what they are of
Hmm.
sorts.
That's interesting. So, I mean, what you've talked about has been fascinating. I think this has been one of the most fascinating discussions I've had on this channel. In fact, it's both sad in the sense that there isn't a lot of Indian economic history being done for the ancient Indian world. At the same time, it's very positive in the sense that for young scholars, there's a lot to do. So my last question, Matt, where can we find you? Can we find you on Twitter? Do you have a website? How can we keep in contact with you? Keep in
Sure.
touch with the kind of work you're doing?
So I'm very active on certain social media. I'm not on Facebook. I'm anti-Facebook. But on Twitter, I'm Matt D. Milligan.
Yeah.
And Instagram, I don't post much on Instagram, and it's Milligan Matt D.
Okay.
is the account. But basically, if you Google Matthew Milligan or Matt Milligan Buddhism, my academia.edu profile should pop up, and I have a CV and as many published papers as I can put up there legally and that sort of thing. But on Twitter, I think that Twitter is becoming a haven for a lot of scholars,
Yeah.
not just young scholars, but different generations of scholars that are having some great conversations on there. And I've had some really great conversations and mini debates, I think, about Buddhism and stuff
Mhm.
like that as well. So, and people ask me questions on there sometimes too, and people ask for articles. That's great too. But yeah, I'm always kind of open to engaging just about anybody on this topic as long as they're interested, because there's not a lot of interest in ancient economic history of India.
Well, there should be, and I follow your work, and I look forward to seeing a lot more of it in the future. So thank you so much, Matt, for joining us,
So much
and
for
I
having
hope you
me.
take care.
All right. Thank you. Looking forward to seeing this.
Have a good one. Bye.